Okay, so looks like we're ready to go. I'm about 3 minutes late. I kind of have a weird setup going on because my monitor doesn't work the greatest on my laptop. So I'm actually using my home TV as my monitor. So if I look up, it's because I'm looking at the screen instead of the TV rather than the computer screen. So let's get started. Looks like we don't have any viewers yet, and that's fine. So I'll wait a few minutes and then we'll get started. We got 1, 2, finally. All right, so just waiting for the first question to come up. I don't have any numbers on the learning target tracking sheet, so you're going to have to do the best you can in the message that you send me to describe what it is you want me to address. So just waiting for some questions. All of which could have actually been done during class the entire week. Remember, you got to do the questions through Twitter. I cannot actually see the chat that goes on with this stream for some reason. AP Euro and I were never able to figure out how to fix that. I'm sure there's a way to do it, but oh well, that's what we're going with right now. I told you that going into it, so there shouldn't be any surprises. I got 6 viewers, 7 viewers, but no questions yet. Oh, here we go. We got 2 now. Okay, let's try for Tia and Mia, question 1 and 2. I don't have a learning target tracking sheet in front of me, so you're going to have to redo that, and you're going to have to tell me what the actual questions are. For whoever baby D is, the differences between natural laws and natural rights. So natural laws and natural rights are essentially the same thing. So natural rights are basically the rights that a person is given through God. They're thought of as being God-given. So you're not supposed to have them taken away from you. So things like freedom of religion would be considered a natural right. Freedom of speech would be another one. And then what we've talked about in class 2 is the problems with natural rights is one starts to have that debate of what is technically considered God-given. Like some people think that I've heard this argument plenty of times over the past couple of years that access to health care is a natural right, and then you have arguments that break out over that. So that's always tough to figure out what exactly is considered a natural right, because it really comes down to who the person doing the interpretation of a natural right is. So necessary and proper clause from Fat Ron, whatever. So yeah, necessary and proper clause. So that is basically known by as the elastic clause, and so basically the necessary and proper clause comes back to something that we talked about that's really associated with loose construction. So in the Constitution, it talks about how and I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty much what it says in the Constitution, is that the government may do things that are necessary and proper to carrying out its everyday functions. So the problem comes in when you see what the government needs to do on a daily basis is if you're only using strict construction, then it would be really impossible to do some of the things that the government is supposed to do, because you can, with a strict construction, you can only do the things that are in the Constitution. So with loose construction and necessary and proper clause, you get to do things that are, well, necessary and proper. So some of the things we've talked about before, the IRS is not in the Constitution anywhere, but it does say in the Constitution that you can tax, but then it doesn't say anything about how you're supposed to collect those taxes. So the United States government created the IRS because it was necessary and proper to, in order to collect taxes and enforce tax laws. The Federal Reserve, which is our national bank, there were two versions before that, the first and second bank of the United States. That wasn't anywhere inside of the Constitution either. But the government collects taxes. What do you do with the money after you collect those taxes? You need to put it in a bank. So that's what the Bank of the United States and the Federal Reserve was used for. How do you pay your bills? You have to write a check, just like you would these days. So basically that's what the Federal Reserve is for. Because one of the things back then is you didn't want to put your money in a private bank because that would be showing favoritism to one company over another. So necessary and proper is basically I can do things that are necessary and proper in order to help me carry out my functions as a government. Describe how society benefits from citizens actively participating in civic life. Okay, so civic life is basically you going out in your community and finding out what things are wrong with it, and then actively going out and trying to fix those things. So if no one participated in civic life, none of the world's problems would be solved. You know, some people take active roles. They see people who are homeless and they go out and try and find them. I actually saw a guy on the side of the road today that had a sign that said, "I need a drink." Not exactly the type of role that maybe we would do. Maybe it'd be worth, you know, trying to find someone that might, you know, be trying to do a little bit better than that. But it can be something as simple as maybe, you know, I need the speed limits reduced, or we need to provide better parks for our children, or things like that. So civic life is going out and trying to find things in your community to make better. Now, the thing that adds on to that, though, too, is that much of the things that much of the steps that are taken to improve civic life are done through political life. So I might have, let's see, you know, for the park, I might go and get in a political debate. I might start a petition. I might start a movement to try and make a new law that addresses a problem in the United States. Let's say pollution was a problem. So your air is polluted in your community, and so that's a civic life because it's causing, you know, dirty air in your community. So you go through the political process in political life and make laws or regulations that would then try and eliminate or reduce some of those issues of pollution that you were seeing in your civic life. So, all right, the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause, that's Quran. Don't worry about it. How about that? The Commerce Clause. Tia and Mia, identify the similarities between American democracy and English political heritage. So some of the things that you see that are the same is you have bicameralism. So in the English system of government, in the parliamentary system of government, they have a bicameral house, a bicameral legislature. You have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So that's an upper and lower house. With the United States, you have Congress, which is also a bicameral legislature, and so they have the upper and lower house, with the upper house being the Senate and the lower house being the House of Representatives. We also see the English Bill of Rights. Some of the things that were mentioned inside of the English Bill of Rights, we also see within our own Bill of Rights for the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So those are some of the things that we borrow from them. All right, Quran. A subpoena. So a subpoena is something that's created that forces somebody to come and testify. And that's one of the powers that Congress has in terms of oversight committees. So an oversight committee, the power of oversight is to basically, you can essentially legally drag somebody in that works for the government to basically answer questions about their conduct. Why did you do this? So like an example of things that have been in recent news is Congress was curious on what was going on with Donald Trump and James Comey. So they subpoenaed James Comey. He was forced to basically come and testify in front of them. When Hillary Clinton was having her issues with Congress regarding the Benghazi treatment, she was being sent subpoenas to try and testify in front of a congressional committee. The same thing with some of the people that work for her. Now, you don't necessarily have to go and testify, because if you're going to plead the fifth, then what you'll do is you'll tell them, well, I'm going to plead the fifth, and then there's really no point in actually coming down to even testify, because nothing is going to actually be achieved. So that's what a subpoena is. Can I play the role of committees? Okay, so the role of a committee, the way that we had talked about that is basically, so committees, standing committees are within Congress. So just like when we talked about the president, it's impossible for the president to be an expert on every single thing that's dealing with running the government. It's impossible for one person to become an expert in all the responsibilities that Congress is supposed to have. So basically what you do is you have these committees that are formed up that are supposed to act as someone becoming an expert in that field. So that's why we have a committee for agriculture, a committee for education, a committee for the military, a committee for, you name it, there's probably a committee for it. So anytime a new bill is created, so that's somebody trying to get a law passed, anytime they introduce it, it will be sent to those committees to consider and evaluate through hearings and discussion on whether it should be handed out to the entire Senate or the entire House of Representatives to go ahead and actually be debated on the open floor and then voted on. Now, keep in mind, they can make amendments to that bill while they're in committee. They can add riders onto it. That was one of the things we talked about in class. So a rider is, hey, you know what, this bill's pretty good, but I'm going to add some unrelated things on here, which sounds really ridiculous that you can do that, but it is legal. That, you know what, the bill is so strong, it's going to pass whether I've got these crazy things on it or not. I'm going to turn the light on. All right, maybe that's a little better, and maybe not. Okay. Next one, Tia and Mia, explain why power, authority, and legitimacy are important characteristics for any national government. Okay, so power and authority are basically the same thing. That's the ability to actually make decisions and carry them out. Could you imagine if the government could make decisions but then had no way of carrying them out? You couldn't force anything to happen. So that would be like saying, hey, I'm going to pass a new law, but then I have no way to actually force you to adhere to that law. And then with legitimacy, that's extremely important, because that means that you're being recognized as the rightful ruler. So we discussed in class that there are different ways of establishing legitimacy. So those were the theories of rule, natural law, natural rights. We talked about social contract theory. We talked about force theory. We talked about divine right of kings. So let's just kind of keep this in the present context, is there are a bunch of people who do not feel that Donald Trump is a legitimate president. So you have this resist movement, or you have this not my president movement that you see the hashtags. I've been seeing that since November. And some people in the United States believe that he's not a legitimate president, so they don't recognize him as the official authority. Well, while that's a small minority of people, imagine if that was widespread. Imagine if 80% of the people in the United States, with the current system of government that we use right now, didn't believe that Donald Trump was the president of the United States. Everybody was like, oh, not my president. How effective of a leader could he actually be? Probably not very much. So, you have people like the dictator in North Korea. He uses force theory. If you don't recognize me as the legitimate leader of North Korea, well, we've talked about what happens to those individuals. So, okay. Next one. Explain filibusters and cloture. Sure. So a filibuster is basically, this is only for the Senate. Not one time the House of Representatives could have a filibuster, but they don't anymore. This is not something that you'll find inside of the Constitution. This is something that you'll only find in the rules of the Senate. The Senate have their own rules that they have to stick to. So a filibuster is basically, I know that something is going to pass if it comes up for vote, and I don't want it to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically stall. Now, sometimes it's a successful tactic and sometimes it's not. Like we even talked about in class that the longest filibuster that ever happened was 24 plus hours. And it didn't matter because after he finally stopped speaking, they just passed the bill anyway. So the only thing you really need to know as far as this class goes is a filibuster is meant to try and delay a vote and prevent a vote from occurring because they don't want a bill to actually pass. Now, how does it end? There's two ways to end. One, the person shuts up and sits down. That's the easiest way to end it. Now, the other way that you do it is called you get cloture. And what that is you get 60 senators to vote to actually force the person to stop talking. Now, that's extremely difficult to have happen because the only way you would think that that could happen is if, well, let's put it this way. If Republicans right now wanted to go ahead and we just voted strictly on party lines, I think it's 55 to 45 in terms of the Republicans. Well, you need 60 votes. So if every Republican voted for a Democrat to stop the filibuster and shut them up, it wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have 5 Democrats go ahead and basically what's called cross party lines and vote in favor of shutting that person down. So that's why it's difficult to achieve cloture, and a filibuster can be such an effective tool for trying to prevent certain laws. It seems like it could be kind of silly. It does kind of go ahead and promote more discussion and collaboration across political party lines, but it's something that's pretty much here to stay, at least for the time being. All right, next one. What is the next step after a law is found unconstitutional? Well, the only thing you can really do, Terry, is the only way you can make it constitutional is if you were to pass an amendment that then made it constitutional. I mean, because, or you could, well, you can do what Donald Trump has tried to do, and then it didn't really work for him either, is, so what happened with him is you had the travel ban. Now, technically, that wasn't a law. It was an action, a decision made by the President of the United States. It was challenged in the lower federal court system, and it was found to be unconstitutional. So basically, that means you can't do that anymore. So what he did is after about a month or so, he slightly altered his original action, his original travel ban. And so he tried it again. But then what happened is, despite it being slightly different, someone challenged it again. It went through the court system again, and then was found unconstitutional again. The difference is going to be with that particular case is that Donald Trump, from what I have read, is looking forward to trying, instead of just letting it die in the lower courts, is he's going to try and appeal that to the Supreme Court. But basically, short story, if it's found unconstitutional, the only way that you could make it constitutional would be to pass an amendment. Give you one more example. Congress at one time passed an income tax law. So you could be taxed on it, based on your income. Everybody does that now. But when it was first done, there was nothing in the Constitution that said you could do that. So then it was challenged. It was deemed unconstitutional, and that's why you have an amendment specifically in the Constitution. I don't remember which one it is that created the okay for passing the income tax. Okay. Terry, I did answer your question, but I'm taking so long to answer some of these. You might have typed that before I actually start talking about it. Identify historical influences on American society. Hold on a second, I got a follow request. Okay. Messages. Notifications. All right. Let me see this. We're back. Yeah, Terry, you have to amend the Constitution. Yes, that's the short answer. Let me get back to this. Identify and summarize the principles of American democracy. So it just goes back to things like equal rights. I mean, it's self-explanatory. just what was it, equal rights, liberty, meaning that you are free from government control. So things like that. That's really all you need to know. Okay, next one. Let's see, did that one. Terry asks, can you go over the last things we learned about the shortening of the sentence and the delay and all that? Okay, so there's three things. There's a pardon, there's a reprieve, and there's a commutation. And I actually just was listening to the radio this on the 2.5 hour drive home I had today, because people were playing bumper cars on 94. They're talking about Obama commuting a sentence. So this helped me remember what it was. So a commutation is when to commute someone's sentence means that you're in jail and I shorten your sentence. So let's say that Terry committed a federal crime and she's in jail. She was sentenced for 25 years and I shorten it to 15. I've shortened it. She's still serving time. It's so it's just shortened. A pardon is basically like a get out of jail free card. You're done. We talked about how that was what Kwame's family was hoping for at the end with sorry, that was what the Kwame Kilpatrick family was hoping that Obama would do at the end of his presidency, because at the end of every president's term, when they're leaving office, they tend to pardon quite a few people. And well, Kwame wasn't fortunate enough to have that happen. And then the other one would be a reprieve. A reprieve is something that I really haven't actually seen happen but one time in my life. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't actually happen. And this wasn't even from the president. This was at a state level with a governor, I believe. But a reprieve is, let's say, again, Terry commits a crime, because that's what she's best at, apparently, in our scenarios at least. So if she were to, she's supposed to enter jail, she's been convicted, but she doesn't start her sentence till, say, next week. I can delay when she's going to start that sentence. She's still going to serve her sentence, but I'm going to delay when she actually starts that. Like I said, I haven't actually seen much of that in my lifetime. Just the one instance that was with the governor from Illinois. But again, that is just another option. Okay. How 3 branches of government have applied the Constitution. Okay, so the president has applied the Constitution to expand his power. That would be the executive orders and executive agreements. We don't actually see those inside of the Constitution, but they are deemed as constitutional. With Congress, we look at the Judiciary Act of 1789. That would be where they create the lower federal court system. We see cases where just judicial review, that's not actually in the Constitution, which I always find funny, because that's such a big turning point as far as the power of the Supreme Court. We can see other things with Congress, which would be, well, pretty much anything that's dealing with loose construction is Congress using the Constitution to expand their power. So, all right. Next one: historical influences on American democracy. So that'd be Judeo-Christian influences. So that would be things like human rights. We have the Enlightenment, which was a time period in the 1700s, right around the time the United States was obviously born. 1776 was the Revolutionary War. Constitution was ratified somewhere around 1785 or so. So what you saw were many of the things that you see inside of the Bill of Rights again. So you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those are things that actually, believe it or not, were not very popular across Europe and the world. Is you didn't have freedom of speech. You could be thrown in jail for things like that. You didn't have freedom of religion. If you take AP Euro, you'll find out all about how Europe was about making sure that you didn't practice the wrong religion. So that's the Enlightenment. If you look at the Roman and Greek societies, that they had republics. So obviously we're a republic, so we borrow from them in that case as well. Let's see, expressing public opinion. Mr. Phillips, that is not going to be on your test. Anything in 9 you can throw out, so let's just throw that out there right now. Anything in chapter 9 is not on your final exam. Baby D, I think that's Diamond. At least I thought that was it. I think she responded last time for economics, Diamond. Rights of local government are determined by your state. Your state is the one that determines the rights that your local government has, how they're supposed to operate. That's one of the reserve powers. And I'm throwing out a term that maybe some of you just went blank on, a reserve power for the United States, or excuse me, for the state governments. So what is the structure of the legislative body? So we're talking about basically the makeup of the Congress. So when we're looking at senators, we see things like 2 senators per state. Just remember the Senate, which unfortunately some of us have forgotten. Senate is the one that has equal representation in the House. Your representation is based off of your population. So other things that you should know is that the House of Representatives are typically younger. They're more diverse. That was a true and false question that actually threw people off. I don't know why, because we talked about it in class. But anyways, it's more diverse. And if you're like, what's diverse mean? It means that it's very different. Like, to show you how it's more diverse, the Senate is not very diverse. It's typically made up of old white men, where you have in the House of Representatives, you have more women, you have more non-whites, and they're younger. So it's more diverse. You got to keep in mind 6-year terms, not limits. There are no term limits for Congress. That could change soon, but anyways, 6-year terms for senators, 2-year terms for House of Representative members. That's pretty much it. That's the structure right there. Oh, I mean, you got to keep in mind some of the requirements too. 25 to be a House of Representative member, resident of the a United States citizen for 7 years, must live in the state, not the district. You don't have to live in your district as a House of Representative member. With the Senate, you have to be 30, you have to be a U.S. citizen for 9 years, and you have to live in the state. Senators don't have districts, they represent the entire state. So, all right. That one. How is leadership organized in the House and Senate? Well, with the House of Representatives, you have the Speaker of the House. That is that's the leader of the House of Representatives. Underneath him, you have the Majority Leader, is it the Floor Leader? It doesn't matter. I'm not asking a question on that part, anyways. And then you have whips, which basically act as a messenger, a go-between for between the Speaker of the House and the members of the House. You're going to have Republican whips and Democrat whips. Basically, it's like, hey, we want you to vote this way. This is what the party's going for. So they're basically just a messenger. Then you have the President of the Senate, who really is just the Vice President. They don't get to vote unless there's a tie. Anytime I hear anything going on with the Senate in the news, the President of the Senate is not the one being mentioned. It's always the Senate Majority Leader, which is going to be the leader of the Senate. Duh. So whoever is the party with the most members, if I recall, the person with the highest seniority, I believe, becomes Senate Majority Leader. And if that's not the case, don't worry about it, because I'm not asking that deep on that one. All right, let's try the next one. What ideas are the Constitution based off of? I don't know how to answer that question. No, I mean, the ideas of the Constitution are based off of basically, it's a combination of the Virginia plan and New Jersey plan. I don't know if I ever had a question like that in class. But some of the, actually, so yeah, some of the ideas came from, those were the Bill of Rights, I thought, but You got some inspirations from the Declaration of Independence. You got some inspirations from England. You got some inspiration from the state constitutions were already made prior to the actual constitution. So you borrow from all of those. Again, you talk about borrowing from Judeo-Christianity. You talk about borrowing from the Enlightenment. You talk about borrowing from republicanism, which was created through Greek and Roman cultures. Greek first, Roman second. So Anti-Federalists' biggest problem is they did not like the fact that the Constitution did not come with a Bill of Rights. They were not going to give in unless the Constitution was given a Bill of Rights. Now, the Federalists thought that the Constitution was perfect as it is, so they weren't willing to compromise at first, but in the end, they knew that was the only thing that was going to get the Anti-Federalists to pass it. So when they finally agreed, we'll go ahead after you ratify it to add the Bill of Rights, the Anti-Federalists were satisfied, and then the amendment process went into place. They proposed 12 amendments, only 10 passed. I don't remember what the 2 that didn't pass were, so we're not going to go down that route. All right, let me see here. Informal checks and balances, informal powers and checks on the president's power. So an informal check on the president. The only informal one that we had discussed was would be something like the press. So what? And this is where everyone made. I'm sorry, anyone who got this question wrong. This is what you got wrong, is you were talking about how, oh, the press can just report bad things about him. Well, just because you do something bad, like you make a bad decision, I mean, you had to have been more clear, because I don't know what bad means. Does bad mean that he signed a bad bill into law? Like, there are plenty of people who think that Donald Trump does things that are bad, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what he's doing is unconstitutional. So the key that I was looking for in that written response was, if the president is trying to do something unconstitutional, then they can report on that, and then that makes the public more aware of them trying to do things that are unconstitutional. But as far as formal checks, let me see here. Make sure I answer your question. If you're just looking, your question only specifically states on the president's power. So 2 that I'll mention, or a couple that I'll mention, would be the Senate has the power of advice and consent, meaning that the president can't just nominate anyone. Like, Donald Trump can't be like, hey, Mr. Norton, you know, you'd be a great choice for Secretary of Education, so come on down and work in Washington with me. He can do that, but I don't automatically get that position. I have to go in front of the Senate, basically be interviewed by members of the Senate, and then they'll have a vote to see whether or not I should be considered the Secretary of Education or not. And, you know, occasionally, sometimes the Senate says no. Other things, if the president wants to try and pass if he negotiates a treaty, the Senate is supposed to be able to approve that as well. That's why we also talked about the difference between an executive agreement and a treaty. The differences are that a treaty must be ratified by the Senate, and an executive agreement does not. So other things too, if a president vetoes a bill, then we have the override process, and that means 2/3 of the House and the Senate have to vote for overriding it. Not too many of those things happen, although there was an override late in President Obama's presidency, but I don't recall what it was about. I was just shocked to read that it actually occurred. Other things too, if you want to talk about it, the president just doesn't get to propose and keep his budget how he likes it. It has to be approved by Congress. That'd be another formal check. All right, next one. I already did that one. Terry, ex post facto law. So ex post facto law means after the fact. So whatever I'm doing, let's say that right now I was doing something that's legal, which technically, I mean, obviously I'm doing something legal right now, but let's say that tomorrow, whatever I did today becomes illegal. So they pass a law, and so whatever I did today is illegal. You can't go back and arrest me and charge me and punish me for doing something today. Because when I did that, it was legal. And, you know, obviously if I had known it was illegal, then I could have made a different choice. But when I made that decision, there was no law that I was aware of that, I mean, it didn't exist, whether I was aware of it or not, that it was being broken. So you can't punish someone for doing something that was right during the time that it was done. The process when there's no majority vote from the Electoral College. So what you're discussing there is going to be if no one receives the majority of votes from the Electoral College in an election. So what happens then is that the president is going to be the winner of the presidential election. And there's a little bit more to it than that, but it's not where I need to get into it with this class. But basically, the House of Representatives selects who the winner of the presidency will be. And if I recall, each state gets one vote, and whatever, that's still doing too much right now for this level of course. And the Senate will decide who is going to be the vice president. And that's pretty much all you need to know for that part. Summarize why the colonies rebelled against Britain. Come on now. That's, you know, I'll go over it, but we've talked about no taxation without representation. That's kind of like the key thing that everybody learns in elementary school in 8th grade and 6th grade. But there are plenty of other things too. When we look at the Declaration of Independence, they go through. We did a scavenger hunt for that. You did an actual breakdown and analysis of the Declaration of Independence. But all the laundry list of complaints that the colonies had are why they rebelled against Great Britain. So that would be things like illegal search and seizure, which is protected by, I believe, the 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution. You had trial by your peers. That wasn't really happening. You had there were a number of other different things we talked about that we didn't talk about, like the intolerable acts, but things like that. But if you can just remember, for the most part, unfair or no taxation without representation, they were very upset about that, amongst other things. But that's the one that is kind of like the basic to understand. Okay. Okay. Terry, I have no idea. You gave me like a sentence fragment, like political, when you talked about enlightenment. So you need to retype that question. Explain how power of the purse, power of advice and consent, impeachment, and oversight are used as tools of checks by the legislature. Okay, so power of the purse, that goes back to when I talked about the budget. So the president can't just basically do things that require money without consent. That because when we talk about, he has to have his budget approved, and so the budget is basically him saying, here's how I want to spend our money. And Congress has the power of the purse saying, we don't really approve that spending, so that's too bad. So that can be a check. Power of advice and consent, I already covered, so I'm not going to do that again. Impeachment, there's a formal one that I didn't mention earlier. If the president breaks the law, then you can go ahead and get rid of them. So when Bill Clinton was impeached, it wasn't because, like, the most common misconception is that, oh, he was impeached because he lied about cheating on his wife. There's a little bit more than that to it. He was impeached because when he had lied about not having any sort of interaction with his mistress, is he was doing it while under oath in a court case, and that is what's considered perjury. So he technically was breaking the law. So what happens is that when a public official breaks the law, you can draft articles of impeachment, which some have tried to do against Trump so far. I've mentioned that in class. They haven't gone anywhere. But if the House of Representatives votes to proceed with the articles of impeachment, they're done. That's the thing you have to keep in mind, is that's the only role that they have in the impeachment process. The trial is held inside of the Senate, and then the Senate has to have, I believe, 60 votes. It might be a little bit more than that. It might be 66. Anyways, you're not going to be asked the number of votes on your test. And then if they convict him, then he's removed from office. So that's what impeachment is. What were the other ones? It was oversight. And I already talked about oversight earlier, so I'm not going to do that again. Mandates. All right, and then the next one says unfunded mandates and devolution. Well, those are two different things. All right, so mandates. Mandates are requirements. So it's like, hey, we've talked about funded mandates and unfunded mandates. It's like, hey, we need you to actually make these changes. And so a funded mandate would be like, here's some money to try and actually make those changes. An unfunded mandate, it would obviously be, hey, you're going to have to make these changes in order to keep getting this money. But too bad I don't have any money for you. You're going to have to take the cost on yourself. So mandate, just think of mandates are requirement. Funded, I'll give you some money or all the money to actually fulfill those requirements. And unfunded mandates, pretty self-explanatory. And then to get back to devolution, devolution is basically, one second, requests, other things, hold on. Let me do this real quick. No, the final is not, I know it says section 1 to section 9. I think you're thinking of chapter 1 to chapter 9. Your final exam is chapters 1 through 6. And then 9, we just didn't cover it enough. Sterling, I covered your question on impeachment. What are the differences between expressed, implied, and inherent powers? I'm going to get back. I'll get to that question in just a moment. I want to finish the devolution one. Devolution is just another name for new federalism. So that was the time period in the 80s through late 2000s with Clinton. I'm sorry, late 1990s, because his presidency ended in 2000, where the government was trying to give power back to the states. So they were handing back some of their power to the states. Because when we talked about dual federalism, we talked about how states were losing power because of loose construction. And then we talked about cooperative federalism, as states were losing power because they were actively asking for help, welfare of their citizens. And then we talked about creative federalism, where states were being forced to do things that they didn't necessarily want to do in order to keep money or to continue receiving money. And then new federalism was the time period in the 80s, started with Reagan, carried through the end of Clinton's presidency, where they were trying to give some of the power that they had taken away from the states back to them. All right, differences between expressed, implied, and inherent powers. First of all, don't worry about inherent powers, because I threw that out because it's not really all that important. It was just something that, whatever. I'm not going to get into it. It's too much of a discussion and takeaway. We only have 15 minutes left. So expressed powers mean that they're expressly written in the Constitution. I can see them. If there's a question like, can the government do that? Let me check the Constitution. Yep, it's sitting right there in whatever line you can find it in. Implied powers goes back to the loose construction. It's the necessary and proper clause. Can I do this? Well, I can't find it in the Constitution, but I can kind of play with the words to go ahead and make an argument that I can do it. Like, for instance, the U.S. government can create the USDA. That's the United Drug, whatever. They're basically responsible for monitoring the safety of prescription drugs and medicine, things like that. And that's basically done because of the Commerce Clause, meaning that it goes back to another question really from Commerce Clause, is that they get to go ahead and make laws regarding interstate trade. We talked about well, we'll go back to the IRS example. We talk about in the Constitution where the Air Force isn't exactly in the Constitution. Well, not exactly at all, because airplanes hadn't existed, yet we have an Air Force. So we are able to create that out of an implied powers. It's not expressed. So implied powers basically are born out of expressed powers. And I probably just threw a bunch of people off with that, so sorry. Why founders were careful to limit the political power of the majority. Okay, so basically everybody enjoys particular rights. So this basically goes to the rights of the minority. Because even if you are in the minority belief, you should still have certain things protected, like your freedom, to have liberty, to have freedom of speech and things like that. Yeah, I'm going to probably not do that learning target next year, so don't really worry about that. Can I go over organizing national power? Okay, so organizing national power, that comes in the forms of 3 forms. So that's federalism, confederalism, and unitary. So each are like unitary is at one end and confederal is on the other, with federalism, which is what we currently have, being right in the middle. The United States technically has experience with all 3, because unitary is what England was using. Is basically the national government is the be-all, end-all. They control everything. They can basically tell state and local governments everything they have to do, and they don't really have a choice in anything else, and if the national government doesn't want them to. Confederalism, that goes back to the Articles of Confederation, where you have a very weak national government. It's not completely helpless, although if you look at the Articles of Confederation, when we use them, the national government did seem kind of helpless. So the state and local governments, we'll just say state governments, were extremely powerful. And if you remember, in almost all cases, I didn't say all, but almost all, anytime the national government wanted to do something, it basically had to get permission from the states before it did it first. Hey, I need some money from you. Well, you got to ask us first. And, well, if we say no, that's too bad. And so if we look back at we talked about what are the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and what problems they solved. Well, one of the weaknesses were you had no ability to tax. You had to ask for money. If they said no, which pretty much they always did, because they had bills of their own to pay that they're trying to recover from, the national government didn't have any money. They didn't have, or states didn't have to provide troops for the army. So when Shays' Rebellion happened, you didn't have an army. They're like, hey, national government, we need an army to help stop this riot. And the national government's like, sorry for you, I got nothing. And going back with that same thing about not having an army, you couldn't force the British to leave the forts that they had in the Ohio River Valley. You couldn't force the Spanish to open up the Mississippi River, because they shut that down. Because, I mean, what are you going to do? You're the United States. You don't have an army. Great Britain is not there to protect you anymore. So not a big deal. And looks like I'm going over the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation already. So some other things with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, that would be things like there was no uniform currency. That means there wasn't one single currency. If you look at the United States today, we all have one currency. But back then, there were 14 types of currency, one for each of the 13 states, and a national currency. So no one really knew. Like if you're in Georgia, you've never seen a New York dollar in your life, probably. So somebody slaps down this weird-looking New York dollar. You don't even know if it's real. So that was another problem. We'll just leave it at that for that. They couldn't regulate interstate trade, so you had 13 sets of trade laws, and all the states made trade laws that would favor themselves. So that was another problem. I am running out of problems with the article. Oh, another Articles of Confederation problem. You needed a unanimous decision, meaning every state had to agree to change the articles. We talked about in our class before plenty of times, was always has been several cases of your short answer response, and you'll probably see it tomorrow. You only need 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment. But back then with the Articles of Confederation, you needed 13. It's already hard enough to pass an amendment today. Imagine if you'd have 13. So the example I always love to do, I used to play a trick on kids in 8th grade. I'd be like, hey, we want a pizza party. So where are we getting it from? And I knew not everybody was gonna go ahead and vote on the same place. I'm like, oh, well, we don't get any because not everybody could agree. And just to pass a law, it was 9 out of 13, which is like 75%. You don't even need 75% today. You need 51%. So, how does Congress change of a bureaucracy? I have no idea what that means. You're going to have to do that one again. How have the three branches of the government applied the Constitution? I suggest you rewind the video when we're done because I already did that. Thoroughly explain the federal system. I forgot to do the federal system. I'm sorry. So when we talked about back with the three organizations of government, federalism. So we talked about how unitary was where the national government is really, really strong and the state governments are really, really weak, and then the confederalism is the state governments are really, really strong and the national government is really, really weak, and then federalism is straight down the middle, basically. That was what dual federalism was. States have their responsibilities and the national government has their responsibilities, and they'll basically work together. And then now Terry wants thoroughly explain the federal system. Are you talking about, Terry, type back, are you talking about, do you want me to go over the 4 types of federalism, like dual, cooperative, creative, and new? Because I'm not really sure if maybe I've already answered that part in what I just finished. So I don't really know what you're asking me here. Okay, so Mike King, what are the ways an amendment can be ratified and proposed? Okay, so, all right. So, 2 methods for proposal. So, you need to have both houses of Congress pass the, basically agree that it should be proposed by a 2/3 margin, 2/3 vote. The fractions for proposal are 2/3. So whatever answer you come up with should have 2/3 in it. Get it? 2/3. Okay. The other way, which has never been done, but that's okay, it's still an option, is that a special convention is called at a request of the states, and then at the convention, 2/3 of the states ask for it to be proposed. So now we're flipping we're changing fractions here. We're going to 3/4. So for ratification, your answer should always have 3/4 in it. Now, they both deal with the states. Now, a lot of the wrong answers I read is there was like Congress and the president. The Congress and president have nothing to do with the ratification process, and the president doesn't have anything to do with anything in the amendment process other than maybe being a cheerleader. So the first method, and most commonly used, all with the exception of one time, is state legislatures then decide whether to ratify it or not. And you need 3/4 of the state legislatures to go ahead and ratify it. The other way, which has only been used one time, is that states then hold special elections to where they nominate people to go and basically attend a state level convention, and then those conventions decide whether or not to ratify it or not. And then it's still 3/4 of those state conventions have to be in favor of ratifying it. So whoever Bleak Tiny is, how is power organized at the national level? That was done earlier when I talked about federal, confederal, and unitary. So go back and look at that. Why founders were careful to limit the diamond? I've answered that question already. No. Where do they get their power from? Where does who get their power from? Terry, you don't have a final exam tomorrow, so when I see you in second hour, you can actually explain to me what on earth that question means, because I am lost. What 3 events that caused the power of the federal government to expand? Okay, so that's going to go into the transition through federalism. So with dual federalism, what caused the I gotta hurry up because we're running out of time. What caused the power of basically dual federalism to decline with state governments was the loose construction of the Constitution. So basically with loose construction, the national government was picking up powers that basically it didn't actually have because it wasn't expressly written in it, but it was deemed to be constitutional. So that was the beginning of the end for dual federalism, was with loose construction. So then we get to cooperative federalism, and that happens during the Great Depression. And one of the responsibilities of the state is that they have to take care of the general welfare of their citizens. So the problem is that they can't do that because the economy is in shambles. There's so many people who are homeless and without money that it's just overwhelmingly impossible for the state to do that. So the national government basically comes in and cooperates with the states to take care of those things. That's where we get things like Social Security, social welfare programs, so unemployment insurance, like I said, Social Security. I don't know if it was available at the time, but food stamps would also be another form of social welfare. And then we have creative federalism, where basically states were being forced to do things that maybe they didn't want to do in order to continue receiving federal funding. So, like for instance, states are supposed to be able to determine what drinking ages are, but through creative federalism, the national government comes in and says, "Hey, we give you federal dollars to at least help maintain the highway system in your state. If you want to continue having that same amount of federal dollars come in for that particular issue, you need to change your drinking laws from 18 to 21. So if you don't want to, you don't have to, but you have to remember that you would be losing out on some federal funds." Some other things too, like sometimes the national government will basically try and coerce the states and into doing things with education that maybe they don't want to. And the way that they get them to do that is they basically hold money in front of them and say, "Hey, you want some money? Yeah, I want some money. Then you need to do this." "Well, I don't really want to do that." "Well, then you don't get any money." "Well, okay, I like money, so I'm going to go ahead and do that." So those are your different ways right there. Um, what do we need to know about the forms of government? Um, okay, so basically this will be in both sets of tests tomorrow. Is you need to know, like if I describe a classical form of government, you need to be able to pick that out. I didn't ask a question on all 8 forms of classical forms of government, but I use many of those classical forms of government as answer choices. So if you don't know anything about, I mean, if it's abundantly clear to you which one it is, then it's not going to be an issue. But if you're struggling, you need to be able to sit there and go through your mind and go, well, I know a republic is this, so it can't be this particular answer. Or I know that a dictator performs in this way, so it can't be that answer. And that's as much as I can give you. And Terry, I think what you're referencing now at this point is, I think you're referencing popular sovereignty, where where the government, the ultimate source of government authority or government power is the people. That's what popular sovereignty is the government shouldn't be able to do things unless the people will it. Now, we've talked about before where if the government gets out of hand and doesn't respect the will of the people, that the possible solution is to replace the government in one form or another. In some cases, it's peaceful. You can just simply vote people out. And then, as you've seen in our country, we've had some violent outbreaks over it, like the Revolutionary War. And then we had the Civil War, basically, too, where the southern states didn't believe that the government was adequately representing their interests and were abusing the power of the government and basically abusing the rights of the people in the South. So those would be some cases that come up. Anti-federalists. It's pretty vague, so I'll just say those are the people who opposed the Constitution being ratified, um, and they were not happy because mainly it didn't have a Bill of Rights, and they thought that the national government was being created and through the Constitution to be far too powerful. Okay. All right. Let's see here. I need to close some stuff down because they're blocking my window. And of course, it's not going to work. That's not what I wanted.
You need a website. Why not do it yourself?
All right. Let me see here. What happened here? All right, there we are. Cannot get this to go away. All right. Well, we're technically at the end time, but I'll stay on another. Let's say until 9:45. If you actually have questions, I mean, I know there's only 12 of you watching, but I don't have any other questions being put in here. So if I don't get any extra questions by 9:35 on my clock, we'll go ahead and end it. And then if you're in first, second, and fifth hour, your final exam is tomorrow. And if you're in third and sixth, because I don't have a fourth hour, then you get to wait until Monday, which I don't think is very fair. If you missed anything, I guess the fortunate thing is that you get to possibly rewind this. I think I need to get an actual webcam because this looks grainy and terrible, and I got to step my game up. Yes, Terry, I already answered your question about the Electoral College. What did Madison tell me? That I look like I'm broadcasting through a baked potato, whatever that means. Okay, man, goodness gracious. I only saw part of this, so I did not discuss. All right, I did that. Political parties, customs, and traditions change the Constitution. All right. So political parties can have changed basically the Constitution through the process of let me fix this. There we go. All right. So basically what's happened is by being able to select judges to the Supreme Court or the federal court system in the lower ranks, you're able to put people in. I still don't like this. Oops. All right. You're able to put judges who think like you in those positions, and those judges are going to ultimately be the ones who determine how the Constitution will be interpreted and applied in certain cases. So an example that I've used before in class is that when you had Roosevelt, so Franklin Roosevelt was in office as president for like around 16 years or so. And so when some bills were passed and he signed them into law at the beginning of his presidency, they were challenged and then they were taken to the Supreme Court, and eventually they were shot down as being unconstitutional. But because he was in office for so long, 16 years, federal judges on this, at all levels, but mainly the Supreme Court we're going to discuss is important, were basically resigning, retiring. So as one of the duties as president is when a Supreme Court position opens up is you get to select who eventually replaces that person. So enough people had resigned or retired to where Roosevelt starts packing the Supreme Court with people who view the Constitution just like he does. And so when you get enough people who you know will view the Constitution just like you do to be in the Supreme Court, you can then try and pass those laws again. I mean, a lag on this feedback, but and then voila, they just were all of a sudden constitutional because they tried to pass similar laws again. Let's get back to other traditions. So let's stick with Roosevelt. Is people began to think that a person shouldn't be president for so long, and he was in there for 16 years. Now, an argument can be made, well, people voted for him for 16 years, he should be able to do that. But an amendment was created to where the president can only be in office for 2 terms of 8 years. And that goes back to a political tradition of George Washington, where he only stayed in for 2 terms. Other traditions too, George Washington had a presidential cabinet group of advisors. That's not in the Constitution, but it's still deemed to be constitutional. I did the American Democracy and English Political Heritage, difference between New Jersey and Virginia plan. So the New Jersey plan was, we go back to the Constitutional Convention, and the New Jersey plan was the plan that was favored by small states, and that had a unicameral legislature, and it had equal representation. And that was a big thing for the smaller states, because the Virginia plan was actually proposed, or at least the way it's always presented in the textbook, is that was presented first. And that was based off of the population. So the larger states are like, well, I've got more people, so I should have more say, and that's just the way it should be. Well, that wasn't a very big drawing point, like a very big selling point for smaller states to get involved, because you'll always be at a disadvantage. And you have to remember, back with the Articles of Confederation, it was 1 representative per state. So the unfortunate thing, the fortunate thing for the smaller states is, well, if I just stick with the Articles of Confederation, I get equality, so you can throw that thing out the window. So New Jersey plan was based off of equal representation. That's the big thing to take away from it. And the Virginia plan was based off of the more people you have, the more population you have, the more representation you have. And then we have the Great Compromise, where we combine both of them. You can see both of them in there. You can see the Senate is the New Jersey plan, and we can see the House of Representatives is the Virginia plan. And then we have, let me see this real quick. You need matching funds. Hold on, let me get back to this. Describe the 3/5 compromise accomplished regarding representative states. Okay, so 3/5 compromise. So you have to go back to, hey, we've got this whole thing solved. We're going to go ahead, and the House of Representatives is going to be based off of population. So the southern states are like, well, I got all these slaves in my states. Can I count them as part of my population? Because if you do, that means I have a greater population, which means I would then be awarded additional representatives as far as the House of Representatives goes. That's a big deal, a big advantage for the southern states. Of course, the northern states are like, you treat those people like property. They're not even able to vote, like, ever. They're property. They're not actual, you don't treat them like actual people. So then we have a great deal of disagreement. So basically both sides get something they want. The southern states were pushing for a 2/3 majority vote to pass any law. Northern states were not really having that. They don't want that. They wanted a simple majority. The southern states also didn't want anything to happen with slavery. So an agreement was basically made. We'll count 3/5 of your slaves as part of your state's population. And we'll agree not to touch slavery, period, for 20 years. And then in exchange for that, we're only going to go with a simple majority in order to pass laws. So that's basically what the 3/5 compromise turned out to be. All right. Main arguments of the Federalist Papers is basically that with the way that the government was created, through checks and balances and separation of powers, that you would prevent any one group of people from gaining too much power and abusing the rights of the people. It would also prevent factions from basically forming as well. I did popular sovereignty. How does the Constitution create a separation of the powers of government? Well, that's pretty easy. You have the legislative body, who basically creates laws or bills that can become laws. You have the president that's supposed to enforce the laws, so that he has a separate role. He's not creating laws on his own. He only gets to enforce them. And then you have the Supreme Court, which is the judicial branch. They are interpreting basically what the laws really mean in regards to the Constitution. So nobody has too much power. Like I said, the legislative branch, they only get to make laws, or at least propose them. Now they have some other duties too, but they're the only ones who can do that. And then the president has many duties, but he's the only one who can do that. And the main role is enforcing laws, and he has other things too. He's a diplomat and things like that. And then the Supreme Court, obviously, they have their role as well. All right. Let me see. I had to go back here. Legislative checks on the president. I already did that. That was me talking about power of the purse. That was me talking about overriding a veto. That was me talking about advice and consent. That was me talking about impeachment power. So things like that. Do you need to know a lot about Madison? No. When do you need matching funds? I have no idea what you're talking about. Why are block grants considered better? Block grants have a greater deal of flexibility. So categorical grants will basically, and this is to break it down to be a little bit more simplistic. So if I gave you money, and we'll just say that I gave you $100, and I said that you can only spend it on pencils, then you can only spend $100 on pencils. Now I'm trying to make this more of a simplistic scenario. Obviously, the national government's not going to give a state $100 to spend on pencils. But if I gave you $100 and said you can spend it on school supplies, well, I could buy pencils, and I could buy paper and notebooks and markers and red highlighters and brown pens, and I do have people who ask for those things. But as you can see, I have more flexibility. Now I can't buy. Maybe you could. I was going to say school shoes. You can't buy a new car and say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to use the $100 to help pay for it." Well, you can't buy a car for $100. If you can buy a car for $100, I wouldn't. So what I would say is, like I've just shown, is that a block grant allows for a greater deal of flexibility. So, am I out? Am I out of questions here? It is 9:45. I'll wait a couple more minutes. If I have to go to 10, I will. I'm not going. I'm sleeping in the morning. I'm sleeping till 6. So I've gone through all my personal messages that were sent. I've gone through all my mentionings that I can find. And I'll wait until 9:48. It's 9:46 on my clock. It's in the book, and it talks about granting money to states and wants a state to match it. Well, I'll have to look at that. I don't know that particular part of the book off the top of my head, so we'll have to look at it. One would think that was probably considered an unfunded mandate, and sort of funded and unfunded mandate, because not supplying all of it. We'll talk about it tomorrow. I see you for second hour. You can point out where that's at. Not a big deal. So, I mean, I know the economics book basically inside and out. The government book, for the most part, I mean, obviously I ran into something that I'm not necessarily familiar with, and I don't think you want to watch me look it up in the book if I had one. My book is at work. right, well, it's 9:48, so we're going to go ahead and finish it, and best of luck tomorrow. See you later.